Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing the what I would consider to be the last of, and also part 3 of the silly challenges to the oral Torah. Okay, so today's topic is what I'm going to be using to close out this particular group of videos. I think this one closes it down pretty well, and if anything, I think this is the one that essentially will prove out the point that I'm making with these videos. So again, just to recap, there are considered to be, according to Torah Moshe, to be about 613 mitzvot or commands that were given in the Torah, and these cover, different aspects of life that the Israeli/Jewish nation is supposed to basically maintain and take part in during the time, either when the people of Israel are in the land of Israel or when we are in exile, and under all circumstances there are mitzvot that cover being in the land outside of the land of Israel and all those different situations that may come about. So one of the things is that there's a basic claim that I've mentioned in a number of videos that the written Torah never required an oral explanation and that it can be followed as written alone. Now, one of the ways that you can easily disprove this claim, and I kind of saved it for last for a reason, is when it comes to the particular statements in the Torah that deal with an eye for an eye, or at least the English translation of an eye for an eye, where it basically mentions that there's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, so on and so on. And one point even says a soul for a soul. So the basic question you would have is if you accept the written text of the Torah as to mean an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, how do you practically live that out in a society? How do you make a practical situation where the written text saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is literally what you go out and do? Or is it possible that the written text was never expected to be taken in that methodology? And if we look at the Hebrew text, we'll see some things in the wording that denotes that there is, in fact, a Torah Shabbat Peh, an oral Torah, which explains how to practically do what's there and what is actually meant by what's there. So before we begin, one of the things I would think that I found interesting when I was thinking of this topic and also considering what to put in the video is I wanted to know, well, what do the Karaites, for example, say about this? Because Karaites, for example, are a group of people who basically hold that there was no oral Torah at Mount Sinai, or at least some of them will say that. Sometimes I've felt that they're not always very clear on that when you ask them a very specific question about that. Specifically, if you mention Mount Sinai, some of them may say that they don't believe that anything survived from that time to the present, but I've never been able to clearly get one of them to give an overall statement for all of them. But one of the things that came up, I looked at the Karaites Insight website just as a start, and I just wanted to see, well, how do they interpret an eye for an eye, like literally, because they reject the Talmud as a oral Torah that explains how to do the Torah. They have areas where they agree with elements of the Talmud, but they disagree that the Talmud is a source for it or a source of information for it. Now, sometimes they're not very clear about the issue of Masorah, meaning that I once asked a Karaite, is it the Karaite claim that no one has a Masorah that goes back to Mount Sinai? And he would never give a clear answer on that. If there's some Karaites watching, maybe that could be something to give a clear answer on. So what I noticed on this Karaites Insight website for when it came to an eye for an eye, or in Hebrew the way it's said is ein tachat ein, is that he says here at the bottom, some Karaites believe that the phrase an eye for an eye is meant to be taken literally. As well as one well-known curate once told me, a true Torah government will have a department which renders the appropriate bodily punishments, such as the removal of an eye or the knocking out of a tooth. Besides finding this as an emotional and intuitive level barbaric, I tend to take the non-literal view of an eye for an eye for textual reasons. I invite you to follow along as I present my evidence based on a textual analysis of the Tanakh. Now, this is really interesting because if he's saying that, like there's Karaites out there who say literally there's going to be a department set up and that will mandate and regulate the removal of eyes and teeth. I mean, this basically gets into a lot of hysteria because one of the problems you get into is, let's say that you have someone who is, for example, blind, and they cause another person who's not blind to lose their sight. Is it really equal punishment to say an eye for an eye? Okay, well, you've caused me to lose my sight. Now I'm going to cause you to lose your sight. Well, wait a minute, the guy's already blind. He can't see. So how is what you're going to do to him like equal? Someone, for example, who, um, let's say as an example, is a piano player and their livelihood comes from piano playing, and someone who basically has no livelihood, they just kind of, sit on a couch and do whatever, and he causes damage to the piano player to where the piano player can't use his hands. Is it equal to say, okay, well, now you got to lose your hands if it doesn't mean anything? Versus like, oh, okay, well, I'm not losing anything by losing my hands. Well, now the piano player is completely out of work. Not only has he lost the use of his hands in that format, he doesn't have the ability to bring a livelihood home, especially if this is someone who's been doing this for years, and his whole retirement is based upon the idea of him playing the piano. So as you can see, there's a number of problems with taking the text in this angle, and we'll see that the written text itself like basically explains that this is not meant to be what it is in English, at least, or at least how the English translation comes about. And you'll see that this idea that it means, and I wouldn't even say literally, the question would be, okay, well, what exactly did Hashem mean when this statement was made in the Torah? Not like whether it's literal metaphorical, because that's kind of a different issue. You could read any text and say, okay, well, I don't know, do I accept this as being literal or metaphorical? The bigger question is, what does Hashem even say about it? Okay, so let's challenge this claim. Let's use like Torah Moshe, which this is what we're here for. We want to know exactly what Hashem meant when he gave the Torah, and what is the Masorah that was passed down from the time of the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai until the modern era amongst Torah Moshe Jews. So essentially, when we look at the text, what we see is the following. That the text, if you look in Shemot, which is Exodus 21 through 21, chapter 21, verse 24, you find the following, where it says, Ein tochath ein, shen tochath shen, yod tochath yod. And what that means, translated, is, and this is the thing, it says ein tochath ein. Tochath usually means like under. In most English translations, they kind of put it as for, but in this situation, it basically means like to be under. There could be a circumstance where somebody says move forward, but it's not like a straightforward meaning of the word. It doesn't exactly give the impression that it's literally meaning for an eye. So ein tachat ein, shen tachat shen, eye under an eye, if you will, shen under a shen, tooth under a tooth, yad tachat yan, a hand under a hand. And then it continues to the next line, says, regel tochat regel, kuvio tochat kuvio, kivuyoho, petza tachat petza. And then essentially what, like I said, what I've listed at the bottom is it's a little bit more complex than saying it's just, okay, it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a leg for a leg, this or that, injury for an injury. Because again, the wording here is not normally of what you consider. You normally consider it to be ein bishvil ein or ein la'ain, but why tachat? Why exactly the word tachat is there? And the same thing where it says chaburo tachat taburo, like a break for a break. And the question is why the word tachat? There's no place in the Torah when this concept is mentioned where it uses anything except for the word tachat. So if we go even further, if we go into Vayikro, the next one of the next places where this concept is mentioned, and I don't have the arrows here to point it out, but essentially what it says here, for example, is when dealing with the issue of if a person like hits a person or causes them to die and things like that, where it says nefesh tachot nefesh v'ish ki yiten mum be'amitho ka'asher asa ken li'asa lo shaver tachot shaver ein tachot ein shen tachot shen ka'asher yiten mum ba'adam ken yineten bo. So the question here is, again, this mentions that same issue, but this time it says a nefesh for a nefesh, meaning like almost like a soul for a soul. And it essentially says that, when a person like causes damage to another person, it brings down this concept of, a break for, break under a break, if you will, eye under an eye, a tooth under a tooth, and so on and so on. So the question is, why is it in every situation when this concept is mentioned, the word tochath is being used, or tachath is being used? Why specifically this word and not another word that would give the impression that it specifically means for, an eye for an eye? But this word tochath doesn't specifically mean for in the sense of like, okay, take this and remove this and then it's equal. It doesn't give that impression here. So if we look at, okay, well, one of the things that I find interesting when I was looking into this, that Ibn Ezra actually mentions an interesting debate between Rav Sad de Gaon that he had with a Karaite concerning this issue. And the basic issue is that when Ibn Ezra mentions this particular debate, he comes at it from the angle of Ayn, where he says that Amar Rav Saadia, לא נוכל לפרש זה פסוק כמשמעו. כי אם אדם הכה עין חברו בשרו שלישית אור עיניו, איך ייתכן שיוכו מכה כזאת בלי תוספת ומגרעת? אולי יחשיך אור עינו כלא הוא יותר קשה וכויה ופצע וחבורו כי אם היו במקום מסוכן אולי ימות ואין הדעת סובלת. So he brings up a very interesting point. Rav Saadia Gaon, according to this Ibn Ezra, is in a debate with a Karaite. And the Karaite's name, for example, is Ben Zuta. So essentially what Rav Saadia Gaon mentions, okay, well, this particular area of the Torah, you can't take it to mean what you're claiming it means, meaning that you literally have to remove somebody's eye if your eye is, like injured or removed or something like that. You literally have to try to physically do to them what was done to them. He said, because one of the difficulties you get into is, what if you, for example, are saying, okay, this person caused another person to lose their eye, so I'm going to remove this person's eye. But what if you remove his eye and he dies from it? You've now killed him, and you haven't brought about an equal situation. What if, for example, he caused damage to someone's hand, for example, and you try to cause damage to his hand, but you cause more damage or less damage in the attempt than what he he caused to the other person? How do you specifically make sure that under the circumstances that they're exactly equal? It's literally impossible. It's literally impossible for it to be taken that way. So he's explaining to the Karaite, for example, in Ben Zuta, that essentially, you can't take it to mean what you're claiming to mean. And Ben Zuta comes back and says, well, lo katuv b'makom acher kasher yiten mum ba'adam ken yeneten bo. So Ben Zuta is trying to say, okay, well, no, but it says in another place where, essentially, you will like give him the I guess you can say, almost like saying the mum, like almost like a disfigurement or something that he gave. That's what you're supposed to do. So Rav Gaon responds and says, יש לנו בית תחת על, והנה טעמו, כן יינתן עליו עונש. So essentially, what Rav Gaon counters is in saying that the text itself in Hebrew has a bet in it, which is supposed to be understood as al, meaning like on, or tachat on. So essentially what he's saying is that the structure of the Hebrew language basically means that this is a punishment, for what's being done. But not in the way that Ben Zuto is saying. That essentially what they get into is, as he goes even further, is that essentially what this is saying is that you would have to pay, for the damage that you caused to the person. You, like, let's say, caused a person who, let's say this person makes money as a bird watcher, for example, as an example. And their livelihood comes from looking at birds, analyzing them, and studying them, and then reporting back. You cause them to lose their sight. Well, you losing your sight doesn't correct the situation. It doesn't even like help this person out. Okay, the person's blind. They may say, okay, well, we blinded this other guy for you. Well, that doesn't help me out. I'm a bird watcher. I've just lost my entire livelihood. My kids can't go to college. It doesn't do anything for you to take his eyesight. He might not need it. He might be doing a job where he can just hear things and he's perfectly fine. It's not an equal circumstance. And even if you physically did something else to him to try to supposedly make it equal, it still doesn't help the situation. I still don't have a job, and I still don't have the ability to pay for my kids and my family. So essentially what we'll see is it being explained by Chazal, and also Rav Saadia Gaon gets in this a little bit later in this back and forth, is that essentially what the Torah is saying by using the word tachat is that a person is supposed to pay for the damage they've done to a person in several different methodologies of payment. And we'll see this in just a second, meaning that if I cause damage to your eye, I've got the court has to look at it from a complete overall, standpoint. Okay, this person's job was to be able to see things. So you have to pay to try to get him like physically sound again. If possible, you have to not only pay for that, you have to pay for the embarrassment for what you've done to him. You've also got to pay for like whatever medical expenses he needs, and you need to essentially pay him for his lost wages. So that's essentially what the Torah is getting at. And it's set up in a situation where the court has to find realistic ways to make this happen, because of course you can't say, okay, well, the guy makes $200,000 a year. I'm poor. I don't make $200,000 a year. Well, how do we get that back? Well, again, then the person may have to work to assist the person. The court The Torah-based court, has the ability to try to determine what is the best way to try to help this person in the current situation that they're in, so that the person who caused the damage is assisting them through this situation. And we'll see in a second that the wording is there also in a specific way in order to show the seriousness to what happens to a person when they're injured or damaged because of the mistakes of another person, because of the bad choices of another. So essentially, if we keep moving on, it brings the question, as we mentioned before, how do you correctly perform these actions? So as always, I usually end up going to the Mishnah Torah. I hold by the Rambam in a lot of areas, but I also look at a lot of different information, as you've seen. So in Hilchot Hovel Nazik, he says the following, and this is in chapter 1, section 1. החובל בחברו חייב לשלם לו 5 דבורים נזק, בצער וריפוי ושבת ובולשת. ו5 דבורים אלו כולו משתלמים מן היפה שבין חוסו כדין כל המזיקין. So essentially what the Rambam is saying is that the person who causes damage to another person or injury to another person must pay them. And he says upon 5 things they have to pay for in turn concerning the person: the damage, you could almost say like the grief of the person, the medical needs of the person, any kind of embarrassment that is caused to the person, and any kind of cessation of like whatever their lifestyle was, for example. So essentially, the court has to look at this and say, okay, what things are being caused here that causes the damage, because what's equal to the situation. If a person's caused a person to have only minor damage to which they can come back from in about a week or so, the court has to rule based on that kind of assistance that's necessary. If the person has permanently lost the ability to do certain things that are requirements for them, the court has to determine how the person who caused the damage pays for that. And it says, essentially, this is, the concept that's mentioned here. Now, he continues in the bottom part. What I just read was in the yellow, where it says in Aleph Bet, נזק כצד שאם קטע יד חברו או רכלו רואים אותו כאילו הוא עבד נמכר בשוק. כמה היה יפה וכמה הוא יפה אותו ומשלם הפחות ההפחית מדמו. שנאמר עין תחת עין, again going back to Shemot in ויקרא, מפי השמוע למדו שזה שנאמר תחת לשלם ממון הוא. Now he makes a very interesting point here, and this is in contrast to people who say, you can just go by the written text as it is, blah, 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 you just take off his hand and we're done. No, the issue is the Rambam brings out a very interesting point in terms of Torah Moshe. He explains that when the Torah was given at Har Sinai, essentially by saying "Mipi Shmuah lamdu shezez shene'amar tachad leshelem mamon hu," what he's basically saying is that Hashem is the one who explained that the understanding of the word tachat, when it says ayin tachat ayin, shen tachat shen, that essentially came from Hashem. That tachat essentially means payment. That the payment of the person because of the damage that we mentioned earlier, for the damage to them, the emotional stress, the medical attention that they need, and also the embarrassment, as well as any kind of stop in the lifestyle that they had. This is the thing that Hashem intended by saying this statement. And Rambam explains in a different place later that essentially the reason why the word says ayin tachat ayin rather than ayin tachat kesef, or like eye under money, is because the written text has to contrast the type of loss that a person has caused, so that a person will look at it and understand my actions have some very serious consequences to them. Not meaning that, okay, a person has to sit there and maybe he didn't get the lesson that day and not understand that tachat means money, but he's like, oh, because I caused this person to lose their eye, I'm going to have my eye taken out. No, the concept is that a Torah-based Jew would look at this and say, okay, I've got to understand how grave my actions are. If I'm out there, like gallivanting through the hillsides and I'm, someone who's causing damage to people, whether that be to them physically, to their reputation, to their property, there's a price that comes along with it. That's a heavy price. And I have to understand for myself personally how I would feel if that happened to me. And I have to apply that to how I treat other people. And that's the reasoning for the strong wording of ayin tachat ayin, so that a person would look at that, a Jew would look at that and say, okay, if I'm doing something that's dangerous and it's causing danger to other people, I have to look at that responsibly and consider how that would affect me, personally and then interpersonally, if something like that would happen to me. Financially speaking, how would it, affect me? In terms of damage, how would it affect me? In terms of my mobility, my ability to, like have an income for myself, in terms of my embarrassment or, such, how would that make me feel? So the written text covers that particular concept that a person has to, develop, for example. So continuing, the Rambam mentions a little bit later in Hilchot Hovel Nazik, ומנין שזה שנאמר באיבורים עין תחת עין, it's again from Shemot כ"א, כ"ד, and ויקרא כ"ד כ', תשלומים הוא שנאמר חוברו תחת חוברו, שמות כ"א כ"ה. ובפירוש נאמר וכי יכה איש את רעהו באבן או באגרוף, רק שבטו ייתן ורפו ירפא. And that's from Shemot Kaf Aleph Yud Het to Yud Tet. הלומדו שתחת שנאמר שבחברות השלומים והוא הדין לתחת שנאמר בעין ובשאר עבורים. So essentially he repeats this point that essentially when the Torah is talking about the type of damage, especially when you get to like parts of people's bodies and things like that, that essentially that is for the payment of repair, the payment of financial assistance to the person who's been damaged, because again, simply trying to simulate, or not even simulate, I would say, trying to duplicate the physical damage to someone doesn't even make any logical sense because you can't do it. And even, the one thing that's brought up in halakha, in Jewish law concerning this issue, is that even when you do pay someone, and financially support, let's say I'm a millionaire and I cause like, let's say like $100,000 damage to someone, and, basically the rest of their lives, they're going to have to deal with $500,000 worth of distress, for example, no matter what, under what circumstances. I mean, look at that and say, okay, here you go, I'm done. I paid it off, perfectly fine. I can just keep doing what I was doing before. The understanding from this is, and this is again the reason why the wording is so strong about ayin tachat ayin rather than ayin tachat kesef, is because of the fact that it's to make the person understand that even with the money, it isn't always about the money. I mean, you may have taken away this person's like love of life. It may have been that, let's say the person is a farmer and farming is just what they love doing. And now you've taken that away from them. You've taken the ability for them to do something not only that financially benefits them, but something that they love. And a person can't just walk around and say, oh, okay, so all right, here you go. Here's some money. I'm done. I can now walk off and just keep doing what I was doing. That there has to be an understanding that, that there's no amount of, you could say almost like financial, I would not say waste, but it's almost like saying that it isn't enough to like damage the person physically, and in some cases, it's not even enough to save the money. But the money is a part of the process that helps a person understand what exactly is the damage they did to the person. If a person would say, okay, well, these are the things you did to me when you did that. When you were driving drunk, as an example, and you crashed into my car, you hurt me in this way, you damaged me in this way, and it's cost me this much. That a person who's keeping their focus on Torah would hopefully make shuvah from that, because that's the whole point of all of these punishments. In fact, that's one thing people don't realize about the Torah. In Torah Moshe, we receive the understanding from Hashem that a lot of the punishments that are mentioned in the Torah are to awaken a person to make shuvah, meaning awaken them to do the Torah correctly, and not just simply to punish. That's one of the reasons that the punishments that deal with, like, for example, death penalties, which are not a part of what we're talking about now, but just an interesting point, are generally speaking, the burden of proof is so high that you don't find any records of there being a lot of death penalties being put out. And in fact, just looking into this issue, because the Rambam mentions here that this was the intent when the Torah was given. When Hashem gave the Torah, the word tachath was put there in order for it to be understood that this was to be a financial situation where a person is supposed to financially assist with the damage that they've done. Repair it. When you look at all Jewish sources that are Torah Moshe based, they all agree on this issue, that this is not like something where you go out and start taking people's hands off. And it's not even like, oh, well, maybe this person here says this, maybe this and that. This would have to be something that you would have to have pretty clearly defined and pretty clearly set in place from the time the Torah was given. There shouldn't be any question thousands of years later about what this means. Because if you don't build the society correctly, for something like this, you could have a completely backward society. You could have a destructive society if people are just like, okay, well, he did damage, he cut his hand, cut his hand off now. And for example, the person like, loses too much blood, and now this person can't work. And then all of a sudden, okay, well, he did damage to his eye. He didn't do it on purpose. Doesn't matter. Take his eye out. Done. And there's some countries that 100% this is what they do. And it's recorded that this is what they do. They cut off hands, take out eyes. I saw one, unfortunate video where a kid was accused of stealing in a country, somewhere, I just won't even say where, but they simply like took a car, ran over his hand with it, like very slowly, as a punishment for it, which is literally insane. This was like a kid had to have been like maybe 5 or 6 years old, you know. So this is the intent. The Torah was not even going this way, and only people went, who decided to do away, like, or decided to veer themselves away from Torah Shabbat Peh, meaning oral Torah, and away from the Jewish Masorah that was received at Har Sinai. They're pretty much the only ones who were looking for a reason to do something as wild and crazy as like literally trying to say, okay, someone lost a hand, I'm taking your hand off. The people who do those kind of things are already looking to do that. And if you look in Jewish history, interestingly enough, you won't find this practice being done. You won't find there being, at some point during the first Commonwealth or the second Commonwealth or the second temple period where people were like doing damage to people and their hands are being cut off. You don't find that in Jewish society. Um, Especially when you look at the Jewish society based on the judicial system, the Mosaic courts, the Sanhedrin. You don't find them like executing people that often. You don't find them taking off hands and taking out eyes and all that kind of stuff. You don't find that because it was never the intent from the time the Torah was given, and that's why all Torah Moshe sources, the Mishnah Torah, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Ben Ish Chai, Ramban, Shulchan Aruch. That's why they all agree on this issue. You don't find them saying something different, like maybe it means that we do actually take off their hands and eyes and things like that for whatever circumstance, just to do exactly what's written there. Well, the question is, well, why is the word tachat there? Why not another word? There's other words that could be used that strictly mean this for this for that. So that's essentially how we handle that. So in summary, what we see here is that it's clear from the written text of the Torah that the only way to have a correct application from start to the present era to finish, to wherever to the end of time, would be for the correct interpretation to have been given from the time the written text was like written down. From the time that the Torah was being practiced and the text was written down, you would need to have 100% clarity on what the Torah means and build in ways to build a correct society. And in fact, I would even go a little bit further than that. It makes no sense that thousands of years later somebody would have a question about something as critical as this. If someone's saying, oh, there's some people who say for something like this, and there's other things you could look at the Torah and say, okay, well, that leaves room for interpretation because that doesn't actually harm people if the interpretation is this way or that way. Someone says, well, what part of my arm does this thing get placed on? Well, that's not a big deal if it goes one way or the other. How big is it supposed to be? When I put this on my clothing. Okay, that's not a big deal. But someone says, okay, literally, we're supposed to be taking the eyes out of people? Under what circumstances? And you would figure that somebody would have had to ask, okay, well, wait a minute. If his hand got cut off from here to here, how far up his hand how do I know exactly what part of this guy's hand to take off? I mean, this guy's bickered. He's, I mean, how do obviously someone would have had to have asked, what are the ramifications and the limitations of this rule? And there would have had to been an answer from the start because nobody would take something like this or anything like it. I mean, you could have like a text that has nothing to do with the Torah, and somebody could say, okay, wait a minute, okay, how do I specifically do this? I mean, that happens all the time in life. There's all kind of things that are written in life. People say, okay, well, how do you do this? Nobody would have waited thousands of years and say, okay, well, we don't know how to do it. Let's just go do society as it is. Okay, well, lost an eye here, take that eye. So this is one of the proofs, a big proof that there was an oral Torah from the time the Torah was given, because or else you would have had Jews taking eyes out and hands off and breaking things, breaking people's arms and stuff like that. It's because, obviously throughout Jewish history, people have had things done to them, and people have had damage done to them, and mistakes have been made, things like that. And no, you don't find any real records of like, somebody doing specifically and saying, well, Ein tachat ein, time to take your eye out. You hit me in the eye, it hurt me for 2 days. Because that's the other thing too. I know I'm a little rambling a little bit, but let's say that someone hits me so hard it blinds me for a week. How do you go back and do the same thing to them? How hard do you have to hit them to specifically blind them for a week? Because that's the only equal circumstance. Let's say that someone, causes me to, damage a ligament in my right knee. Well, how do that 1,000 years ago, how do you go back and try to damage the ligaments in someone's right knee? Exactly the way that it was done. What if, again, what if you cause too much damage? What if you cause too little damage? I mean, what if the person says, "Oh, you got me on that one," and the person's not hurt at all? What if the person already had damage to the ligament? You're not changing anything about their circumstance. So that's where that lies. So I think that that pretty well covers this issue of the silly challenges to the Torah Shabbat Peh. And this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. And take care. Bye bye.